why are US oligarchs okay with Trump disassembling the post-World War II Pax Americana deal that the United States made with the world, which was, we want capitalism, and we want pretty rabid capitalism. And if you don't comply, we're going to rogue state you and isolate you and try to hurt you. But in return, we'll try to keep the world relatively peaceful. We're going to try and prevent a World War III. We're going to contain the Russians. We're going to stop the spread of communism. Like, if these are the things that you're worried about, we're your guy.
I'm John Bruni. This is our first episode of 2026, and it's great to have you with us. This year, we'll be introducing a number of changes to the show, some visual, some structural, all designed to improve the overall look and feel of the focus. The substance won't change. Our commitment to clear, independent analysis remains the same. But how we deliver it will continue to evolve as the year progresses. Joining me tonight from Dubai in the UAE is political analyst and commentator Dr. Roy Casagranda. Roy, welcome back and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, Dr. Bruni.
It's been a good one. It's been a great introduction to the new year, hasn't it? Fantastic. So let's start off with Venezuela. The US intervention there continues to cast a long shadow over American foreign policy in 2026. The removal of Nicolas Maduro's split opinion in the United States. Support existed, but it was narrow. And polling suggests that while some Americans supported decisive action, most do not want the United States running Venezuela. Someone should tell the current acting president of Venezuela about that. But anyway, the Americans don't want to be tied down in long-term reconstruction or anything really political on the ground in Caracas. But what's striking here is that this doesn't look like Cold War interventionism. It actually does look like transactionalism. Remove the problem, stabilize the situation. That is, vice president takes over from Maduro, then step back. One could be generous and say it might be a case of FAFO, F around and find out. Roy, what does Venezuela tell us about American power and how it's being exercised?
I'm beginning to think that maybe that could be a good name for 2026. FAFO.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So the Venezuela thing is just baffling at so many levels, but it's also part of the US's playbook, but from 100 years ago. So the US changed the Latin American playbook really after they overthrew Arbenz in 1954. Arbenz was the president of Guatemala. He was democratically elected. We destroyed Guatemala's democracy, sent in the Marine Corps, shot the place to pieces, and triggered a civil war that lasted a quarter century and killed over 100,000 people. So I don't know if it was like this, oh, what are we doing moment, but and then of course Salvador Allende in 1973, we murdered him. So after Salvador Allende and Arbenz, we sort of softened in Latin America. Obviously, we did Manuel Noriega, we mined the harbors, but it wasn't the same kind of send in the Marine Corps and shoot the place up. So this is fascinating because we bombed Venezuela to take out its anti-air systems so that we could create a corridor to fly in helicopters to kidnap the president. If from the outside, Maduro was incompetent, he was corrupt, he was tyrannical. Getting rid of him should be an improvement for Venezuela. So objectively speaking, it's hard to be sad about Maduro going. His vice president is definitely smarter. She's definitely more competent. She's probably just as corrupt and just as tyrannical. So now Venezuela will have a more effective tyrannical government than it had. As a general rule, that's probably still an improvement. So, from looking at it objectively and standing back, it's hard to say, oh, this is a tragedy. But I think every single Latin American state is now freaking out because this is what we used to do. We would go in. I think we invaded Honduras 8 times, Nicaragua 7 times, and Guatemala 5 times over the course, from 1890 to 1930 over the course of that 40-year span of time. And every time it was because of transactionalism. We didn't like the price of bananas, literally bananas, and we would go in, shoot the place up, switch out the government. The new government would do our bidding. It would eventually either leave through democratic means or get taken out in a coup d'etat. Then we would go in, shoot the place up, bring in a new guy who will lower the price of bananas, and hence the term banana republic. And so from the surface, I think, if you're Mexico, if you're Colombia, if you're Brazil, you're looking at this going, oh my God, is this the return of that banana republic system? Mm-hmm. And it's not the first time we've kidnapped political leaders. Aristide in Haiti, we kidnapped them and flew them to Central African Republic. Like we definitely have that, and that was recently, right? That was George Bush Jr. who did this. We definitely have had our moments where we've intervened in a way that's well, how should I say, not following legal norms. Having said that, this idea that somehow we now own Venezuela or own Venezuela's oil, I think is extremely naive and it's foolish. We couldn't secure Iraq. We were in Iraq for 8 years and we were humiliated and driven out. It's impossible that we will be able to do the same in Venezuela. And I don't think there's any support for a war. So I think this was one of those moments where Trump talks big, but then doesn't really deliver. He needed to distract from Epstein files, and I think he was very successful in distracting from the Epstein files.
Well, I've got to say, Roy, there's a lot to unpack with this. I mean, as a historian, I would like your idea on something. I've been fuffoing around myself with Venezuela and trying to figure out what the next play is. And look, you're right. Maduro's taken out and he was a terrible man. But, the vice president, smarter though she may be, is also a terrible woman, potentially. Maybe a little bit more closely aligned to the American view of things, so long as she doesn't start mucking around as well. But Bolivarian nationalism, can you explain to our audience what that is, where it came from, and how might Bolivarian nationalism become the fire starter, if you will, for something a little bit more complex than what we're seeing in the immediate aftermath of Maduro's extradition back to the United States?
Okay, so I'm assuming you want me to give the historical background to this, so
Yes.
I'll do that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
During the war, the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain decided this was a great opportunity to go get Spanish colonies that it wanted. And the reason was because, right, France had invaded Spain and installed Napoleon's brother as the king of Spain, and that triggered a civil war. And so the Spanish were busy murdering each other. And so the British invaded Argentina. The year in my head is 1806, but I probably am not right about that. So double check my year. And the Argentinians then sent, they were still called Rio de Plata, so river of silver. And then of course, argentum is the Latin term for silver. So that's how it got its name. The Argentinians sent word to Spain saying, hey, we've been invaded by the British, come help us. The Spanish replied, we can't, we're in the middle of a civil war and fighting in Europe, you're on your own. At that point, the Argentinians asked themselves a really interesting question. What's the point in being in an empire if the empire provides you with no benefit? And so they beat the British. The British kept the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas. They stole them basically, but they were driven out of Argentina proper. And then that creates a cascade effect because the Argentinians declare their independence, and then the next thing you know, Gran Colombo has declared its independence, and then Mexico declares its independence, and that's sort of the end of the Spanish Empire in Latin America. When Gran Colombo declares its independence, it comes up with this idea that there should be a single Spanish-speaking Latin American state. And the idea comes from Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar ends up becoming the leader of Gran Colombo. And in that moment, he owned Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. And the idea behind it was to expand it. When Bolivia declares its independence, it named itself after Simon Bolivar, which is where we get the word Bolivia. So like even claimed that it was going to become part of this grand design. And for a while, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador were a single state. Eventually, they broke up. When Mexico got its independence, it included all the way to Costa Rica. And then Central America made a deal with Mexican liberals who were trying to change the government, and they broke Central America out as the United Provinces of Central America. And then the British and the United States spent millions of dollars to break up Central America into these tiny little rump states that we see today. But it's why the flags in Central America tend to all look very similar. The big exception, of course, is Costa Rica. And then it's the Gran Colombe experiment is why Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia have flags that you can't tell apart. Like you can try to memorize their differences, but you'll never succeed. And so the beauty of this idea of unity to me is you're going to create, a powerhouse in the region that then can push back against U.S. imperialism or British imperialism. In the end, the British and the United States won, and the two states that should have stayed unified were broken up. But one of the interesting twists of U.S. foreign policy lately has been it's pushed Colombia and Venezuela closer together. They had been drifting apart in large part because Colombia had been in this decades-long civil war against communists, and it wasn't clear. It was pretty clear that Venezuela was frequently helping those communists. And then since then, now we're seeing Colombia and Venezuela talking to each other, and Colombia has now announced that it thinks it's on the United States' list of government overthrow, which is amazing because the United States backed this government and funded this government for decades, to the point where Colombia was frequently the number 3 state for U.S. foreign aid. It usually went Israel, Egypt, Colombia, with some exceptions. Occasionally Pakistan would push its way up on the list. But to have the United States turn 180 degrees against Colombia is just truly amazing.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. But the idea of Venezuelan nationalism, steeped as it is in that sort of Bolivarian tradition, do you see that things are moving very fast, and there's been such little time between the capture of Maduro on the one side and the settling down of the vice president on the other? There are a lot of angry Venezuelans. They want an improved lifestyle. They've been denied their democratic rights. So, we had Machado lose the election, the last free election they had. And it seems like Donald Trump does not favor her coming back into the Venezuelan political structure, at least not now, even though she sacrificed her Nobel Prize to the great one. But anyway, I mean, that's another story we can get into. However, all of those maneuverings leads me back to one very important point that most people seem to be missing, and that is the Venezuelan people, in spite of the rubbish leadership that they've had for quite some time, are extraordinarily patriotic. And will they be happy to have the gringos coming in, taking their oil and taking the wealth of Venezuela away from them?
I mean, I think we'll end up with a situation like we had in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam, and it just simply won't work. And one of the things that I think is shocking is look at how many wars we've had since World War II. The attacker never wins. It's become this, this rule that the attacker will have. North Korea attacked South Korea and triggered the Korean War, and they lost. Iraq attacked Kuwait, they lost, right? I mean, the attacker never, the United States attacked Iraq and lost. The United States attacked Afghanistan and lost. The attacker doesn't win. The Russians have been fighting in Ukraine now for, are we going on year 4 now?
We're about 4 years, yep.
Yeah, and there's no sign that the war is going to end anytime soon. And so what I don't understand is this belief that somehow everybody has, this time I'll figure it out. And the answer is no, you're not going to figure it out. And in part because of nationalism. There is no way the Venezuelans are going to accept the United States coming in and stealing their oil. That's just not going to happen. One of the great tragedies of Venezuela is it has definitely the largest oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere, but I've been seeing some reports that might have the largest proven reserves on the planet. But Venezuela is a very poor country. And so that oil wealth has not developed Venezuela the way it should. And they have hyperinflation that's just absolutely catastrophic. People can't afford basic necessities. But if a foreign country invades, it will unify them instantaneously and they will fight tooth and nail. The Venezuelan people are a prideful people. They have every reason to be prideful. There's no, the idea of gringos doing it is just insane. There is too much anti-US sentiment in Latin America, in part because of the past, right? There is memory of it, and there will not be any level of trust, especially because Trump keeps saying it's about the oil, it's about the oil. So there's no, like at least in Iraq, there was this, we're pretending to make the place free and we're going to make it better. There was at least there was that pretending that might confuse some of the Iraqi people. Nobody in Venezuela is going to be confused about what would happen next.
Well, actually, you raise an interesting point because there've been many people I've had discussions with over the last. Has it already just? Well, it's still a month. It's still like we're still in January, but still, it seems like I've been talking to these people for a year about the same thing. Um,
Yeah,
so some of these people suggest that, well, I don't know what your problem is, John. The Americans were never great guys. They always raped and pillaged their way through, the international environment, took what they wanted, made up weird cock and bull stories about them being the light on the hill, and they did whatever they
yeah,
liked. So at least Trump, the good thing about Trump is he's ripped that facade off. We don't have to worry about the Americans being anything other than what they are, transactional and ugly. Now, I don't know. I
yeah,
mean, I sit back and I think about this, Roy, and I think, yeah, I've got some American friends, and I don't know if I was in their shoes, I'd be a little bit freaked out by all of this because the kind of lack of trust and the kind of um, wanting to drive a sort of almost an anti-American agenda now is a real thing. I don't see how anyone is going to come out of this sort of situation unscathed. And I think that perhaps this is really wrong-headed thinking. I mean, yes, I know that the United States was always the quintessential power after World War II, and it threw its weight around and did everything. But at least the facade of it trying to do the right thing gave it a degree of legitimacy that Trumpian transactionalism just doesn't give you. You could be comfortable
yeah.
with sleepy Joe Biden doing something or Obama doing something, and God bless his cotton little socks, George W. Bush, another great catch politically. But anyway, the fact of the matter, any one of those could and would be able to do things to enhance American national interest and yet wouldn't freak out the entire planet as a consequence. Where I see everything at the moment go, it's like the whole to hell with the world program that Trump is actually pushing is going to be driving a unique anti-Americanism where countries are going to start bandwagoning in very weird and peculiar ways. And if we stay in the Western Hemisphere, just look at Mark Carney and his extraordinary deal with China. Now, it's not been getting a lot of headline news feed, especially down here in Australia, which is weird in and of itself, fellow Commonwealth country and all. But nonetheless, Carney made the bet that Trump and Trumpist America is a threat to Canada, not only from a cultural perspective, but a strategic and an economic perspective. So he reached across the Pacific, shook Xi's hand, created a $1 trillion trade deal, which I suspect, given enough time this year, Trump will have to come back to and do something about. Because if he ends up having the Chinese behemoth running around with the Canadians up north, that undercuts his entire. The US is going to dominate the Western Hemisphere because part of the reason why the whole Venezuelan thing took place, part of the reason, not the whole reason, was because the Chinese were getting themselves stuck into Venezuelan oil. So,
That's true.
it's almost like you're trying to play whack-a-mole. Once they're in Venezuela, get rid of Maduro, kick out the Chinese, Russians, and Iranians, and then all of a sudden they appear up in Canada. Where else will they appear? Well, as you rightly mentioned, Colombia is looking a bit worried at the moment. Cuba is looking worried. Mexico is looking worried. Where does this end?
So this is a really important point. the old United States pretended to do good and sometimes did.
Yep.
Frequently it didn't. But one of the interesting things about the United States was the State Department was oftentimes filled with believers who really were trying to make the world a better place. And so they would sort of turn a blind eye to some of the cruelty that was going on, and then they would dig in and work really hard where they could. There were exceptions, like when the United States blew up Iraq, a bunch of the State Department officials resigned in mass to protest. One of the interesting things about Trump, there is a tradition in the State Department that when a new president is elected, everybody turns in their letters of resignation, and then the new president goes no and rejects them all, so that it kind of gives the president the ability to bring in new people where the president feels they need to, but then keep the majority of people in place. And of course, in Trump's first term, he accepted all their letters of resignation because he didn't know anything. And so he didn't know that he was supposed to reject them. But B, he was probably thinking, yeah, I can just put in my cronies, because obviously it's always about cronyism. And I think that what Trump has done is he's gotten rid of the facade, but the result is catastrophic for the United States. And this is what I can't figure out. Why are US oligarchs okay with Trump disassembling the post-World War II Pax Americana deal that the United States made with the world, which was, we want capitalism, and we want pretty rabid capitalism. And if you don't comply, we're going to rogue state you and isolate you and try to hurt you. But in return, we'll try to keep the world relatively peaceful. We're going to try and prevent a World War III. We're going to contain the Russians. We're going to stop the spread of communism. Like, if these are the things that you're worried about, we're your guy. Now, a huge portion of the world rejected that, right? The non-alignment movement, and obviously a lot of countries did go communist, and they wanted to go communist. But there was kind of this consensus, at least in Western and Central Europe, that this was an all right deal. Some of Latin America was on board. And so there was stability, there was order, there was sort of predictability in the system. And Trump has torn all that to pieces. He's thrown all of that away. Like, everybody now knows that the United States is no longer a reliable ally. And one of the crazy things he keeps saying is, I need you to pay for your protection. Well, all of those countries were already paying for the protection. So South Korea paid for US bases to be in South Korea. This wasn't Trump's idea. He comes along and he tells the South Koreans, you need to pay. And they're like, dude, have you not looked at the receipts? We're already paying. What is your problem? You want more money? At that point, then, it doesn't look like the United States is doing it for its own interests or to make the world a better place. It looks like it's doing it because it's a mercenary force that's being paid to do it. And I do think that will, over time, not only erode the United States' credibility, I think it's gone, but I don't think it was just Trump. I think George Bush Jr. did a lot to destroy the United States' credibility. Nixon did a lot to destroy the United States' credibility. At the end of the day, I think what the alliance system is coming apart. The fact that NATO is sending soldiers to Greenland to defend Greenland against a possible U.S. invasion, that's like the old Soviet Union's greatest dream ever. It's too bad the Soviet Union isn't around to celebrate. They can make a cake and blow out some candles and talk about how great the United States.
A hammer and sickle cake. A hammer and sickle cake. Red dye.
I bet Putin's freaking out, going, if only our, all those years I worked for the KGB and this was our dream, and now it's coming true.
Okay. Let's look at a little bit more of a conspiratorial bent here. There's some people saying that Trump is so enamored by Putin that at some point in the history of Donald Trump, especially when it went off to Moscow while it was still the Soviet Union to land various deals, I think it was around about the 1986 mark, that he was somehow honey trapped or compromised in a pretty lewd manner. And this is what gives Russia its its ability to influence almost everything that Trump does. Now, stay with me while I sort of move on with this, because I suspect that if Trump does make his play for Greenland, I mean, yes, it's going to ruin NATO and wipe out Western security that's been the bedrock of continental stability for 80 years. That can't be something that we're going to be celebrating, but it's going to give Putin the capacity to win in Ukraine because nothing else will. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, the Russians, as inefficient and ineffective as they are, they've been hurling men at that front line for the last 4 years, and they're moving 1 inch at a time and doing
Yeah,
as though, they're fighting the Great Patriotic War. I mean, the Soviet military was pretty bloody good. The Russian military is not even a pale shadow of one division of the Soviet military because it's really
yeah.
having a hard time struggling through. But if NATO is broken or if there's a crisis of confidence in NATO and maybe the supply chains start drying up with US weaponry to Ukraine and so on and so forth, does this then suggest that this is a very real outcome for Russia, that they could win by default because of what Donald Trump is doing to the Western alliance?
I the answer is yes and no. I think it definitely weakens Ukraine's position. The
Hmm.
Ukraine, if he really does make a play on Greenland, if I were Ukraine, I would start to seriously talk about surrendering territory for peace. But I think states like Germany and France are going to do everything they can to not let the Ukraine surrender. They're going to want the Ukraine to fight this out to the end.
Hmm.
And I guess we're supposed to start saying Ukraine and not the Ukraine anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
For
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
old habit. So I think they see Ukraine as their proxy in a war against Putin, with the hope that this stops Putin from becoming more ambitious. I think if the United States attacks Greenland, all of a sudden Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia come onto the table as a possible next move for the Russians, and so for Germany and France, they have to be thinking, no, 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 we have to keep them in Ukraine fighting so that they don't start to look elsewhere for more territorial expansion.
Hmm.
This is sort of the old fear that states like Sweden and Finland and Poland have had, and Germany for that matter, that Russia wants to go west, and that Russia, right, the Russians keep moving. Where St. Petersburg is, that used to be Viking land. It used to be
Yeah,
Ingermanland.
that's right.
And yeah, and the Kola Peninsula was Finland, and
Hmm.
Finland's basically half its original size because the Russians keep moving west.
Hmm.
And Poland used to be about half a country to the east of where it is now, and the Russians simply took the eastern half of Poland and then took the eastern part of Germany and shoved Poland to the west. That
Yeah,
you can't be mad at the Poles because they were sort of victims in this, but
yeah.
that's been Russia's move, is to constantly not just go east but to go west as well. And so Central and Western Europe, and I think Eastern Europe as well, but Hungary might be the exception, are definitely in freak out mode right now. And they're trying to figure out how they keep Russia from moving further west. And so they have to keep the Ukraine war going. So that's the no part. Uh, I don't think NATO will surrender Ukraine, even if the United States is willing to. I'm
Okay.
starting to talk about NATO as if the United States is no longer a member. And
Well, I know, and that's dangerous talk, Roy, because it's funny. Words have power, right? And I
they
think that
do.
the narratives that have been bouncing around, people are starting to see that the United States is pulling up stumps now. They're wanting to, go back to the Western Hemisphere. I mean, if the great man himself has said it umpteen times in the last 3 weeks, it's got to be a real thing, at least in his head. I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of Americans who had served in Europe who are horrified by the prospect of the transatlantic alliance. Let's put it this way: if it's not in crisis, it is certainly with all this rhetoric being bandied around. When we look at the situation with regard to Greenland, is this a possible situation where Europe could overplay its hand? And that's why we're seeing it move very, very carefully, very slowly, few soldiers at a time, maybe one ship, not a big one, but just to show that the Americans, the Europeans have a pair and they're starting to move into a direction that should theoretically please Donald Trump. But now, because he's already drawn the line around Greenland as being part of the Western Hemisphere, which I suppose from a geographic perspective it is, he's already made up his mind that that is mine and I want that. And even though the various treaties that the United States has with the Danish government and with the Greenlandic people have literally allowed America to do and have whatever they want on that island,
Yeah,
it seems to count for
yeah,
nothing because he wants sovereignty and that's it.
yeah. It's really strange from a strategic economic point of view. There is nothing that we will gain by taking Greenland that we don't already have. There
Mm.
is a base that we built in the 1950s in Greenland. It is a giant ice cave that we powered with nuclear power so that we could do biological experiments to create biological weapons. And the idea was when we were done with the ice cave, I think we finished using it in the 70s, we just sealed it off with ice. Well, global warming is melting the thing and is going to open it up and expose it. Who knows what's in that stupid lab?
I saw an X-Files the other night that dealt with a similar situation in Alaska. So yeah, yeah, it's
Oh,
a real
very,
thing.
very cool. So, at some point, I almost feel like the United States should not try to get Greenland just so they don't have to deal with what's in that lab. But in any
Exactly.
case, like the argument is, well, we need it to make a defense system so we can stop nuclear missiles from China and Russia. Well, we already have the ability to deploy anything we want to in Greenland for those purposes. So there's no reason to do this. This is symbolic. It's like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. It's what a narcissist does at this
Mm,
point.
mm,
But the cost of his narcissistic rampage is so insane that it's hard for me to comprehend. Like, you're going to possibly destroy NATO. You said it's not clear NATO is in crisis. If the US is shooting at NATO soldiers over Greenland, then I mean NATO is effectively dead. And
mm.
I think that's kind of what's happened. The United States has all but declared it's left NATO. In Donald Trump's first term, he refused to confirm that he was going to respect Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The Article 5 of the NATO Treaty says that if one member is attacked, all members are automatically at war with whoever attacked them. And
Yeah.
he refused. He's never once said that he will comply with Article 5. So, in other words, if Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia are attacked, it's not clear the United States will go in. It is clear that the rest of NATO will.
Mm.
I want to add another piece to this. Finland, during the Biden administration, went to the Swedes and said, we want to join NATO. Now, the reason they went to the Swedes is because Finland and Sweden are best friends. They are Germany and France have a really strong relationship. Sweden and Finland have an even stronger relationship. And the Finns said to the Swedes, we can't join NATO unless you do, because we will never do something without you. And so Sweden had, at that point, over 200 years of neutrality, and joining NATO would end that tradition. And so the Swedes said, okay, we have to consider this because your security is really important to us. It should have been clear to the whole world that if Russia attacked Finland, even though Finland wasn't a NATO member, that NATO would make it a NATO war.
Mm.
And it became clear to Finland that that wasn't the case anymore because it was no longer clear that the United States was a reliable anything, right? Kuwait wasn't a NATO member, and Iraq attacked Kuwait, and the next thing you know, the United States is going to war with Iraq. That was the idea that the world had, was if a country's sovereignty was compromised, the United States would come to their aid. And so the Swedes voted on this. They agreed to join NATO. They ended their neutrality, and both states joined NATO. I think what's happened is Donald Trump has woken Europe up, and he's made it clear to Europe that if Europe doesn't start acting as if there is no United States going forward, there's still a Canada, but
Yeah.
there's no United States, that Europe is host. And I think this is actually going to be good for Europe long term. Short term, it's going to create a lot of panic and confusion and upset. But adrenaline is not the worst thing to have in your body coursing through your blood. And so I think that's what's happened is suddenly Europe has a bit of adrenaline that it hasn't been accustomed to since World War II, because it just seemed like the United States was this stable rock that the whole world could turn to, that the whole world could rely on.
It's so interesting because, Donald Trump did something that Vladimir Putin couldn't do. While Russian forces are struggling against Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, it was Donald Trump who managed to reunify continental Europe in a different
Yeah,
sort of way, and in a more profound way, if you will. So I do tend to agree with you. I mean, and I would agree with anyone that says, well, okay, I'll poo on Donald Trump's house for all the things that he does and says. But the one thing that you can't take away from him is that his threatening and blustering against Europe is actually making Europe better. I wouldn't say making Europe great again, but the Europeans are starting to come together. I remember late last year we spoke. We had a couple of European episodes, and they were actually quite good ones. We had a youngish. EU member, and I was, because I'm a bit of a security hawk myself, so I said, well, why do the Europeans, struggle to do things that most people would say is in the common interest and the common sense interest of Europe? Why can't you get your defense stuff together? Why are you always buying American equipment? Why don't you buy from your own, stables and all this kind of thing? And look, he was very good. He understood exactly what I was trying to, well, what I was trying to say and my attack vector. But he then said, you have to understand, John, in spite of the fact that everything that you say I agree with, Europe is not a nation state. So
yeah.
considering that all this plurality of nation states in Europe now have to cooperate and align much closer than they ever had to before, because they have no other option but to do that, do you see that there will be some fundamental changes in how Brussels navigates the governance of Europe to make it, I don't know, have a singular foreign policy, a singular defense policy, and give it what it needs to survive in this much more turbulent environment?
One of the trends, the global trends that has me really alarmed is that there it seems like state actors have all become paranoid and insular, and the alliance systems that used to exist seem to be breaking apart everywhere.
Yeah.
So, states that you would have thought were friends are now bickering with each other. It's almost like we have oxygen deprivation. We've been sucking in too much CO2. CO2, high volumes of CO2, lower your IQ and make you paranoid and angry.
Mm, mm.
And it almost feels like I know that somebody's going to say, oh, but we know that's not true. There isn't enough CO2 in the general atmosphere to cause this, but there's been lots of tests on people's indoors that suggest that we do have high levels of CO2 inside
Mm.
buildings, mostly because we have these air conditioning units that tend to recycle the air instead of bringing in new air.
Mm.
Um, in any case, that trend of breaking up alliances and making people who should be friends not be friends and start backbiting each other, it seems so global. It's everywhere on the planet. If Europe gets its act together, then it'll be pushing in the opposite direction of the general trend. And I think that would be a good thing, just for another reason, just to set an example, like, look what you get from cooperation. Maybe you
Mm.
guys who aren't in, your alliance system is falling apart, should rethink this. Having said that, I I, I think that your Brexit was necessary for this to work. And it might suck for people who are British who still wish they were part of the EU. But the way that the UK used to function was it was the United States' proxy vote inside the European Union. And of course, the
Yes, it
UK
was.
was constantly pulling the European Union, holding the European Union back. And so, in
Mm.
a really profound way, the way that the European Union is going to work is by having the UK out. Scotland breaking away from the UK and joining the European Union would be good. I think that would be a great future for Scotland, but I think the rest of the UK needs to be out for it to work. There was an Italian prime minister in the 1970s when the UK joined it was back then it was the EEC, he said, "Oh, it will fail now. It can't work if the UK is a member." And I think that's what history has shown us, that guy was right. So now going forward, it's got the one thing that it couldn't have in it out. And then the United States has shown that it's not there. I just think this is good for the European Union going forward. Turkey and Hungary are, of course, iffy, right? Because
Yep.
they're not always reliable, but I think they'll start to increase their reliability as well, just because of the threat of Russia is getting louder and louder and louder and louder.
What do you think will happen to the UK? I mean, you speculate that, if Scotland decides to join the EU, that'll be a good thing. But, there's been a long-standing notion that Britain has to either be part of the EU or be part of the United States. So if
Yeah,
the EU has spat Britain out, or Britain spat the EU out, and it's just sitting off the coast, is its fate to be joined in some more official capacity to the United States?
I think the answer is Airstrip 1 has always been a member of Oceania and will always
Right,
be a member of
right. I put my hand up because our country's the other end of airstrip, or we're
Yeah,
airstrip two,
right.
so that's all good.
Uh,
It's amazing.
it's amazing. That George Orwell.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He
Well, I
nailed
tell you what, he was the Nostradamus of his time. My God, my God. So
Oh,
so
I really hate him so much.
well, yeah, yeah. Well, honestly, I do too. Um, so this then leads to another thing, and I was going to make mention earlier. I mean, going back to Carney hedging with China, Europe still isn't strong or cohesive enough to hang together during this dark time. It appears that the Canadian strategy may be what the EU will be angling for in the short term, to have, you know, uh, the big panda bear in the corner to monster Trump whenever they need him to monster Trump. And it's interesting because, you know, Xi Jinping, he's played a very cool hand throughout this whole process, right?
Yeah.
So rather than fall into the trap of being a man baby and throwing up his hands and cursing the moon and doing all that kind of stuff, he's kept it calm, he's kept it steady. Chinese military, the Chinese military is expanding, its technological base is improving. All of these things are happening at the same time as the chaos that we're dealing with in the West. So if this were to play out and say the EU decides, well, look, the United States is just too dangerous, we're going to be doing the Canadian thing and hedging with China. At what stage do you think that that relationship will fail? Because again, hooking up with a totalitarian state, even if it is showing signs of pragmatism, is not necessarily a good thing for the long run. It may give you a short-term hit, but when the big panda decides to come after you and you haven't made up
Yeah.
with the orange one over the Atlantic, you get a bit of a problem, haven't you?
I think this is dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous in a strange way for the same reason that, Germany linking up its economy with Russia was dangerous, or
Yeah, yeah.
Europe relying on the United States for its security is dangerous. During Bush Jr.'s administration, when the United States was going rogue that time,
Mm,
uh, Germany began to look for alternatives to having the United States as its ally. And Brazil and India were two big options because it was nervous about the PRC. It felt like you don't want to go that direction. So it was hoping that Brazil and India, which it felt had enough of its values, right? Both were democracies, both were developing, but were on a good direction. So they weren't, centuries behind Europe. That maybe that was a possible future. And then, of course, India elected Modi and Brazil elected Bolsonaro, and Germany went, "Oh, that's not going to
mm,
work.
mm.
We need to figure out something else." And I think there was also, during the Obama administration, a little bit of a lull, like, oh, maybe George Bush Jr. was kind of a one-off, and we'll go back to normal American politics. And then, of course, Trump comes along, and they're like, "Oh, this isn't a one-off. Clearly, this is what the United States really is."
Yep.
Where the the facade is gone. So
Mm.
I think at the end of the day, Europe is stuck. It doesn't have a good option. There is no good option. If I were a European policymaker, what I would do is I would try to get as many possible allies economically as possible. So I would work with the Chinese, I would work with India, I would work with Brazil.
Yeah.
And so, I would turn to BRICS, ironically enough, minus Russia. So I guess is it BICS at that point? And then the other thing that Europe has messed up on is it should be working really closely with the Middle East. It doesn't, because there's this old cultural rivalry. This, the Arabs just took 2/3 of the Roman Empire, and we're still bitter about it. And at some point, I think Europe is going to have to go, you know what? Egypt should be developed economically. And if it was, it would be a really powerful asset to the European economy, because it's literally just right across a body of water that's really easy to navigate. And then, of course, the GCC states Europe should be working with them as well. They have a massive economy with a very, very little population. So it's almost an economy without a country. But anyway, if I were Europe, I would try to find multiple ways to secure myself, especially now that Germany's broken its economic ties with Russia, and I don't know what the future looks like with the United States. China is dangerous. I wouldn't want to be only with China. That's one of the reasons why China won the war with Ukraine. Russia attacks Ukraine. NATO spends all this money fighting, so it's losing money. Russia loses people because it's doing these stupid human waves that aren't winning, and the United States' relationship with NATO is falling apart. In the meantime, Russia has become completely dependent on China, and as a result, Russia is now in China's sphere of influence, which was, by the way, Putin's #1 objective, was to never let Russia fall. And so Putin, who I think most people would have agreed up until 2021 was a brilliant leader, as of 2022 looks like an idiot. He ruined everything he had achieved for that first 21 years in one big mistake. And he's now made Russia dependent on China.
But this is something that's really quite, from a historic perspective, it's very, it's a thing among people with autocratic tendencies, right? So initially, they start doing stuff that kind of makes sense. You may not agree with what they're doing, but, from a rational, logical perspective, yeah, I can understand why, Putin did the little green men thing in Crimea. I can understand why Putin wanted to restructure Russia. And for every victory that they get initially, they already sow the seeds of their own defeat. And, we saw this with Hitler. Initially Hitler went out and conquered half of Europe and everything was going swimmingly well until it wasn't. And then everything just went. Same thing with Mussolini, same thing with Tojo, same thing with pretty much every dictator that we've seen in the post-Cold War era as well. They may start out with a flourish. They get a rush of blood to their head, thinking that nothing can stop them. It's this arrogance of power, if you will. Oh, well, I've done this and this worked out and that worked out, so therefore I'm a genius, a very stable one, and everything else is going to work out accordingly. And I suppose the one thing that we can probably look at with Trump is that his snatch and grab of Maduro, and this was my initial reaction to that. Well, okay, now he's done this, and all the military commentators were out there saying what a brilliant snatch and grab it was. Not one American casualty, 40 Cuban security guards that Maduro had were killed, and that was good because no one likes the Cubans. But in the end, Roy, it just, I don't know, it just doesn't look like it's going to work out for too many people in the long run. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think so here's my fear. You've got Putin, who's playing this strange game. I don't think it makes any sense. He's not winning, even if he's not losing. He's sort of stuck in this, World War I style stalemate where it's just they're measuring progress by the inches. They're doing human waves. You've got Trump, who's completely insane. He has no knowledge of anything.
Tell us what you really think, Roy.
Yeah, I mean, he's an idiot. He just doesn't know anything. He thinks he knows everything. He thinks he's a genius. which is hilarious. He's like the 70 IQ chimpanzee that we had for a pet that's finally grown up into an adult, and he's like ripping your arm off and beating you to death with it. And you're like surprised because chimpanzees are so cute when they're babies.
Yeah.
Um, and 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 so he's out of control. At some point, somebody's going to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And that mistake could really cost the world.
Mm.
I keep being asked, what's World War III going to look like? And I think it's going to be really short. And the reason I know everybody thinks we're going to use nukes. I actually think we won't. I think World War III won't result in the usage of nukes. What will happen is, okay, World War One. I'm going to use an example that I used recently in another situation. In World War One, Germany won militarily. The Russians surrendered to Germany in 1917. Germany, owned Belgium and was in France defeating the French. The Austrians were in Italy defeating the Italians. Romania had been conquered. The only state on their side that wasn't doing really well was the Ottoman Empire because it had lost Arab territory because the Arabs had gone into an uprising. So at the end of the day, from a military standpoint, Germany was winning. The reason Germany surrendered was it ran out of food. Yeah. And I don't care how good your soldiers are. I don't care how good your officer corps is. If they're hungry, they're going to not fight. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. The German state was collapsing from within because it didn't have any food. The reason that was possible was because the way the German economy was is it made industrial goods, sold them, and then took the proceeds from that to buy food from the rest of the world. So when they do World War One, those trade networks to Canadian and US and Mexican food simply disappeared. And all of a sudden the Germans had to rely on what they produced, which wasn't enough. And as the Germans were eating their cats and dogs and leather boots, they began to rise up and they capture Berlin, the communists capture Berlin and Bavaria, and then Germany goes to the Allies and say, we need to surrender. The reason I'm using this analogy is when you think about it, the whole world is Germany today. What state on the planet doesn't have some food network where it's moving food around? Like the United States buys grapes from Chile. The United States buys beef from Brazil. The reality is even the large agriculture producer states like the United States still have these long tendril food networks. They're buying prawns from Brunei. They're buying salmon from Norway. And once World War III happens, all of that instantly goes away. The big killer in World War III isn't going to be war. It's going to be starvation. People living in cities are going to be in really big trouble. And I think people don't realize that's what's probably going to end the war really quickly is somebody's going to go, look, we're losing, we're starving to death. We'll use the nukes. Let's negotiate out an end. And then, of course, the end will look like the beginning. Nobody will have gained anything. It'll just be, tens, hundreds of millions dead and nothing achieved. And the fact that this is on the table and people are actually talking about this shows how stupid the situation that we're in is. Like this should be off the table. There should be no conversation about World War III. And here's the weird twist: we don't know what the alliance will be. Will it be United States and Russia against Europe and China? We don't know. We don't know what the alliance.
Roy, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid growing up, I used to read these stories about Nostradamus's prophecies and stuff. But if you look at the world and the way that it's all sort of convoluting and changing and aligning in different and peculiar ways, there were a couple of quatrains. Now I don't know whether they were real or not, but anyway, the way that it was interpreted at the time was that America would make friends with Russia, and then China would make friends with Europe. And I'm looking at this situation today, and I'm thinking, Jesus, was that guy Nostradamus really on the money or what? I have no idea, no idea. But yeah, it's strange. Look, we would be remiss if we did not attack another major issue, and that is the Gaza Board of Peace. So, okay, Trump wants to lead a so-called Board of Peace focusing on Gaza. This proposed body would oversee Gaza's post-conflict transition and reconstruction. According to media reports, membership would be limited and time bound unless a participating state contributes $1 billion US dollars in the first year. That contribution would effectively secure a permanent seat. Now, here's where this becomes even more striking. The Kremlin has publicly stated that Vladimir Putin has been invited to participate. That invitation hasn't been denied outright. It's simply been described as being under review. So let me be very clear for our audience. There is no publicly available documentation explaining how this body would be constituted in law or under whose authority it would operate. And that leads to the most important question. If membership requires a $1 billion payment, to whom is that money actually paid? Is it paid to the US government, an international trust, UN mandated fund, a newly created NGO, or a fund controlled directly by the chair of the board himself, who, according to the reporting, would be Donald Trump? So, who authorizes the spending? Who audits it? Under what legal jurisdiction? Because if there is no transparency, no multilateral oversight, and no clear accountability, this stops looking like diplomacy. It starts looking like the privatization of peace. Roy, what does this tell us about power itself and how it's being reimagined in American foreign policy?
I'm just always left in the state of what?
So am I.
Who came up with this and why? Okay, so I'm gonna approach this backwards because
Please.
I don't know how else to do this. What is the goal of this thing even to begin with, right? Is it to somehow I don't even know what this looks like. Is it to make Gaza into its own little separate state with its own sovereignty? Is it to keep it in this sort of peculiar stateless situation where it's just part of the, occupied territories? It wasn't occupied for a while. It's occupied again. Are we gonna do what Trump had originally proposed, which was get rid of the Palestinian population completely, or at least leave some for labor purposes because you need cheap labor, and then build all these really nice hotels because it's on the Mediterranean? What is the end goal anyway? And to have an institution like that, you would think there would be some kind of stated end goal. So I can't even comprehend why somebody would want to be a member of something that doesn't have a clear agenda. And then of course you're going to pay the $1 billion. What is that for? So if the $1 billion was clearly designed towards, again, I don't know how this looks. So you fix Gaza up, you rebuild the damage. In 5 years, the Israelis are going to attack it again. So it's going to get smashed to pieces again anyway, right? As soon as there's another Israeli election, whoever is in power is going to have to attack to bring the people together so they'll vote to keep that guy in power. That's Netanyahu's modus operandi, right? Mm-hmm. So is the fund then, let's say the fund wasn't going into Donald Trump's pockets, but it was actually going to the people of Gaza. Will they leave some money aside to rebuild the next time the Israelis attack? What is the long-term objective here? And then of course, are they going to talk about what happens to the West Bank, the neglected part of this equation? I think Palestinians have like 40% of the West Bank, if not less, at this point, because the Israelis literally just keep carving chunks out of the West Bank. So at some point, the West Bank just sort of goes into non-existence, I guess. It becomes these little pockets of walled off chunks of Palestinian ghettos. It's not the first time populations have been ghettoized. I mean, I remember when the Germans did this to the Jewish population by putting them in the Warsaw Ghetto. So I guess there's a playbook you can pull out and just. But in any case, I don't see how this ends anything, because there's not going to be any structural change no matter what they do with the money. There's not going to be any structural change no matter how they proceed. And Gaza, it's still going to be this peculiar entity that has no sovereignty over itself, and I just don't understand. This is the thing that I don't understand about anything that's happening. Why are the U.S. oligarchs allowing this to happen? Why aren't the U.S. oligarchs freaking out and tearing their hair out and going to Trump and going, look, you're breaking the system that's made us so much money. It
Mm.
almost makes me think that the oligarchs know something that we don't know, and they're in freak out mode. And okay,
Yeah.
and they're trying to figure out. So it's not that they're trying to get the chandeliers and run to the lifeboats because the Titanic has hit the iceberg. They've steered the Titanic at the iceberg, and they're trying to hit the iceberg, and that's what I can't figure out.
Well, you know, there is, and again, I'm straying into conspiracy theory here. The world has collectively 317 trillion dollars worth of debt, which will never be paid back. And the creditors of the world, I think, consist of about 8 million extraordinarily wealthy families. And they're the ones that loaned the money and get their just desserts at the end of it. But with this, there is a sense that you're right, maybe like rats on a sinking ship, they know something about the economy that is going to put us in extreme peril. Mind you, it's not going to put them in extreme peril because, of course, anything that tanks the economies even further means that they can snap up bargains in every country that's collapsing around them. So for the next
It's
cycle,
true.
their families will still be creditors lending governments money until they go through the debt spiral again and we start repeating the cycle. So yeah, I know it sounds a bit conspiratorial, but there is that sense that there are a group of people that know that something is up. Because you made mention earlier when we were talking about Europe and why would the American oligarchs want to damage transatlantic relations? Because if those relations aren't just strategic, they're economic. And, American companies do a great deal of business in the European marketplace. Now,
Yeah.
if all of a sudden that relationship just breaks apart for whatever reason, those companies aren't going to be selling Apple computers. They're not going to be selling IBM. They're not going to be selling Lockheed Martin Joint Strike Fighters. They're not going to be selling anything to Europe. And that's going to have to hurt their bottom line, let alone mean that they're going to have to truncate their workforces, their factories. There's going to be unemployment, mass unemployment, when all of a sudden the figures come out, oh, well, we can't sustain this. We're going to have to axe 20,000 people from the factory floor, which goes against the very thing that Trump wanted to do anyway. He wants to bring the work back to America. Well, he's doing a bloody great job by burning the markets that will make America a mozza. Now, if he continues going down this path, I don't know what happens at that oligarchic level. Do they stage a coup? What goes on? I mean, if I was a rich guy like Elon Musk and I'm sitting pretty at the moment, and I think that the government is going to be white-anting the very power and wealth and influence that I have, I'd want to do something about it. Mind you, you wouldn't want me as a dictator, Roy, but I think like this sometimes. But self-preservation does come in at some point, doesn't it?
You would think it would, and that's what I can't figure out. Like I can't even figure out why they wanted him to begin with.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
what was I? I was in 2025. I was at the World Government Summit, and uh, there were the Americans that were there were basically in two groups. There were the journalists and the professors and the scientists, and then the other group was the CEOs. And the CEOs were all like, "Oh my God, it's heaven! We're going to create a utopia. Elon Musk and Trump are the greatest people to ever live. They're geniuses." And then everybody else was like, "Oh my God, what has happened? We're in so much trouble." And they're freaking out. And,
Yeah.
and I was looking at this going, what the heck is going through their brains? They already know what Trump is. He had a first term. Like
Yeah.
there's no and I think what a lot of them were thinking was they could manipulate him. I think they
That's right.
thought he would give
That's
him
right.
power and they would just control him and they would manipulate him, just like so many people thought about Hitler
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
1933. And boy, were they surprised. And it's like, dude, read some history.
Yeah.
Like before
Yeah.
you decide, let's put this narcissistic megalomaniac guy who completely wants power for the sake of power in charge. Before you
Mm.
do that, go. Are there other examples of this? Like what happened when the French put Napoleon in charge? And then see how that turned out and go, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this. But I mean, that's the genius of stupid people. They always think that they're the ones who are going to figure out how to do the impossible thing, and that previous generations were morons.
Yeah. 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 I mean, God. All right. Well, we'll have to move on to another topic, also staying within the Middle East. Actually, there are two that I'd like to raise. Firstly, what the hell's going on in Syria, Roy? I mean, the Israelis want to set up a Druze buffer state. The
Yep.
Kurdish thing is going to start, bubbling over. If it's not already doing so, it will be doing so in the not too distant future. The new Syrian government seems like it's got fires that it needs to stomp out all over the place, north and south. Where do you think the Syrian government is going to go with all of this? Or do you see that Syria is now doomed to fragment because after the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad left, the very thing that kept the wheels of the dictatorship going, even when it was transposed onto someone else, couldn't make it work there. And so Damascus is now just losing control all over the place. I mean, you've got the Israelis wanting to do whatever they want to do, the Turks are wanting to do whatever they want to do, and that leaves what? Syria and Lebanon? Oh, okay. Good luck with that. This happened before. It'll happen again.
I mean, I think this is U.S. foreign policy come to fruition.
Mm,
The U.S. blew up Iraq, basically triggered a civil war in Iraq that spilled over into Syria, and then the Arab Spring gave the fuel to make that civil war explode, and it did, and the Syrian state collapsed. And the U.S.'s policy in Syria since it broke into civil war was never to keep the Syrian state intact. From a military standpoint, our goal was to fight ISIL, but from a political standpoint, our goal was to get Syria away from Russia, the Russian alliance,
mm,
no matter what it took, the Russian and Iranian alliance.
mm.
And so, in a way, the United States can claim victory, right? Syria is no longer part of the Russian-Iranian alliance. But this poor guy, Shara, like he was part of Jabhat al-Nusr, the Victory Front, which was an Al-Qaeda organization that
Mm.
moderated its positions and began to work with Turkey. Because in the beginning, Turkey actually was their enemy, and then over time they began to moderate their positions, and they eventually, they got rid of the requirement for head covering, and they changed the rules on schools, and they sort of liberalized, and eventually they ended up in charge of Syria. I think nobody fully trusts him because
Mm.
he does have that past of being associated with Al Qaeda. They were bitter enemies of ISIL and they fought ISIL, so that
Mm.
he's got that as a plus mark. But
Right.
nobody likes former Al Qaeda members to begin with. And then I think the Arab states with the money were reluctant to pour a bunch of money into his government because they weren't sure how he was going to use it. And of course, the one thing that Syrian state needs is an inflow of money to develop, fix things, and recreate a functioning state. The Israelis, in the meantime, look like they want to create a Druze state, which is really fascinating because one of the really weird twists about the Druze is for the Druze, the most important thing is not the state, it's the land.
Mm.
So the Druze living in Palestine became Israeli citizens and fight in the IDF. So IDF isn't just a bunch of Europeans who have come over as colonial settlers, and it's not just a bunch of Jewish Arabs who have come over because of whatever reason they were tricked or kidnapped or whatever. There's also these Druze Arabs who fight in the IDF. And, ironically enough, that means that sometimes those Druze Arabs in Israel are in opposition to the Druze who are living in Lebanon. And so the Israelis are doing this in part because they want to show the Druze in Palestine how much they love them. Like, thank you for being there for us.
Mm.
It was never loyalty to the Israeli state because the Druze don't care. It's loyalty to the land that they live in. But I also can't help but feel like it's kind of a form of Zionism. Like, so Zionism is the solution, the end solution for the Nazi goal of getting rid of the Jews in Europe. If you create a Jewish state and the Jews leave Europe, you win. If you create a Druze state and the Druze leave Palestine, maybe that helps the Israelis sort of fulfill their goal of having an Arab-free Palestine.
Mm.
But what they don't
Mm.
understand, if that's their goal, is that those Druze will never leave. That their goal is to fight to the death for every acre that they live on in Palestine. They don't care what kind of state you create or what kind of thing you hold in front of them. And they're really good fighters. So this is not a solution. In any case, I think the Israelis are really hoping for, because I don't think they're naive enough to believe the Druze will move, is to just hurt Arabs, to just hurt Syria, to just make sure there's no functioning Syrian state going forward. Turkey is probably the only reason why the Kurds haven't declared full independence, because the Turks have made it very clear that if the Kurds do, they're going to invade. And so the Kurds still function with and work with the Syrian state to a degree, because they know that that's the one thing kind of keeping them from being invaded by Turkey. Turkey's actually captured a bit of Kurdish land and they're occupying it, but they haven't done a full-scale invasion. And I think that the Kurds are kind of clear that the only way they avoid a full-scale invasion is by still working within the Syrian state. What I'm worried about is that this is a global trend, and it has been really since Yugoslavia tore itself apart, right? To break up into these smaller and smaller micro regions where people have, instead of being patriotic to the larger thing, you're patriotic to the smaller thing. And Somalia breaking up, as another example of this. My fear is that as we end up with more and more fragmentation, it just makes it so that the hegemonic superpowers have an even larger share of the global power, because those small states can't work together. You just look at Central America, right? The end of the United Provinces of Central America has been nothing but a catastrophe for those Central American states. Here we are over 200 years later, and it's 1824. So 202 years later, and here we are, and it hasn't worked out. It almost feels like they would have been better off if they had stayed inside of Mexico. And so I'm worried that's the trend going forward. It's not that I'm against the Kurdish state, just for the record. I just don't know how it happens with Turkey and Iran and their positions on that they will not allow it to happen. Because Iraq and Syria, it's just a snap of the finger away and both break away. In fact, Kurdistan did declare its independence in Iraq a few years ago, and then the Iraqi military invaded it. And because the Kurds were in no position to defend their position, they had to surrender. But I just don't want the world to keep breaking up. Like, we're good. Like, I'm still trying to figure out why Montenegro left Serbia. Like, what was the point of that? You speak the same language.
Crazy stuff.
Was it fast track to the EU? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I suppose a very bad fast track though. Well, Roy, staying again in the Middle East, the next thing that I want to attack is, of course, the Iranian protests. Can you give our audience an idea what made these protests different from those in 2019, 2020? Also, Trump made a lot of noises about wanting to assist the protesters in their fight for freedom against the Ayatollahs. But the Gulf states and Turkey, wary about conflict spillover and refugees, seem to have talked him out of it for now. What did you make of the son of the former Shah, Reza Pahlavi's public positioning, trying to turn himself into a unifying figure for the Iranian opposition? And is there any chance that Iranians would be willing to trade their existence under the Ayatollahs for the return of the monarchy?
Okay, so that's a lot. Iran probably has the world record for the most revolutionary society on earth. They were competing with Egypt, but I'm starting to think that Iran has officially passed Egypt. Egypt has had 4 revolutions since 1880. Iran has actually technically only had 3 revolutions, but there was the Green Movement in 2009. I want to say there was a thing in 2013, but it was quite contained and small. Then 2019-20, and then there was Women, Life, Freedom, and now this. So even though none of them resulted in the collapse of the state, I feel like they count for something. In 2009, the goal was never to overthrow the government. The goal was to reform it. And you actually had members of the government in that group. So Rafsanjani, for example, had become part of it. Karbaschi, the mayor of Tehran, had become part of it. Khatami, the former president of Iran, had actually become part of the reform movement in 2009. So the Green Movement the hope was that the Islamic Republic would survive, but with major changes done to its legal system and major reforms. It failed. The Islamic Republic gave in to none of the protesters' demands. And then the subsequent ones, the one in between 2009 and 2019, I feel like it was 2013, but don't quote me on that year. And then 2019, and then the Women Life Freedom Movement that was very recent. All of those had an edge where they were like, okay, the reform movement failed. It's time to think about overthrowing the state and bringing in a new form of government. They never quite had the momentum that made it so that they could succeed. This latest outbreak, this latest revolution or uprising, I don't know what to call it, was very different for multiple reasons from all of the previous ones. One of them is that it was the bazaris, the middle class, merchant class. The merchant class came out and they started the revolution or the rebellion. They were in the streets, and the reason was that the Iranian economy has completely collapsed. Their currency is completely worthless, and so nobody has any money, which means nobody can buy anything. So the merchants were like, we're done. We're done with the stupid system that's so dysfunctional. We can't even sell people anything anymore. And they came into the streets. So that was shocking because it's the core of Iran's economy. And then the second part that was shocking about this was the violence, not just by the state. The state has killed, I'm seeing numbers all over the place, probably somewhere between 6,000 to 40,000 people. So it's a massive death toll in a very short period of time. I'm leaning towards the 6, but I can't dismiss the larger numbers. The last time the U.S. reported, I think they said it was 2,500, but I'm pretty sure we're way past those numbers. But we're at least in the 6,000 range. But we're also seeing violence from the other side in a way we've never seen before. So, the Baluchis and the Kurds are heavily armed. They have their own militias. They're capable of going to war against the state. And we've seen them come out with weapons before. The Arab population in Iran, which is in the southwest corner, it's right up against the Persian Gulf, and Iraq. They've never come out with their weapons. We've always suspected that they were capable, but we never saw it. They're clerics. So the clergy told the Arab population, go ahead and bring out your weapons. And I think that was a huge shift because it's not just that the Arabs who have never actually done this came out with their weapons. It was the clerics telling them it was okay to do it. Like Islamic Republic now has a serious fracture. And they were targeting police stations. They were targeting mosques. They were targeting anything that reminded them of the government. Buildings from the judiciary were being set on fire. The fact that they're targeting mosques is, of course, shocking because, an outsider looking in goes, "Oh, is this an atheist movement?" But because it's the Islamic Republic, right? All the hatred towards the government has gotten wrapped up with an anti-Islamic movement that's also going on. So it looked like of all the movements that we've seen since 2009, this was the one that had the best traction. It seems to have fizzled to a degree. The rebels keep telling people, please don't lose heart, let's keep going. But we're not seeing the same kind of demonstrations that we were just a few days ago. So it may be that it's cooling down. Way I think we should look at this is it's actually part of a series of events, and that there will be another one in a few years, even if this one stops. And every time this happens, I think the state gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And at some point, Khamenei is either going to die or he's going to get on an airplane and fly to Moscow and hang out with Bashar al-Assad. At some point, he's going to figure out this isn't sustainable anymore. In any case, I had an insider revealed to me that B-52s were on the way to Iran. Their goal was to do
Mm,
strikes. I was shocked because I would have thought the United States would have done its strikes with drones.
mm,
B-52s, I think, cruise missiles are not 100% accurate, so it was going to be messy, and you're going to catch a lot of civilians in the process. I would have thought you would want to come in with drones and do precision strikes on IRGC homes, like kill them while
mm,
they're sleeping.
mm,
But
mm,
apparently, the B-52s were in the air. Once that happened, a series of states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, got on the horn with President Trump and said, "Please don't do this." And there's lots of reasons for that. One of them is, yeah, refugee spillover is definitely a fear. If the Iranian state collapses and its economy collapses, what happens to the population within? Um, Another fear, though, is further fragmentation. Like there is, does Reza Pahlavi have the kind of personality and support in Iran that he can keep the Kurds, the Tajiks, I'm sorry, not Tajiks, the Turkmen,
mm,
the Baluchis, and the Arabs from just declaring their independence? For that matter, the Azeris. Half of Azerbaijan is in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and there's always been this kind of Azerbaijani, like, oh, couldn't it be cool if we could reunite at one point? And so, like, what happens then if there's an Arabistan and a Kurdistan, and Turkmenistan gets a little bit bigger and Baluchistan breaks away? Then do they start asking for the Baluchistan in Pakistan? And then are we looking at further fragmentation? My feeling about Reza Pahlavi is he's basically a white kid, right? Obviously Americans won't identify him as white, but what I mean by that is he's raised outside of Iran. He doesn't have the kind of connections to the Iranian population, and I'm not sure that he will get the kind of loyalty necessary to rule a state like he has. The his connection, his loyalty is to the Iranian diaspora,
mm,
and a lot of those Tehranjalis, the nickname of Los Angeles, a lot of those Californian Iranians, they feel like they've been screwed out of all their wealth that
mm,
they left behind after the Islamic Revolution. And I think their goal is to go plunder. Their goal is to go tear Iran to pieces and steal all its assets. Like, their goal is to grab the chandeliers and run for the lifeboats. And I don't see how he can run a state if his primary supporters are plundering the country.
mm.
Having said that, if he does end up in a position where he's in charge, I really hope he can pull it off, because I don't see anybody else. Where's the other leadership? Like, in the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini was always there. He was this person that you could see, so you knew who the leadership for the Islamists was going to be. By
Mm,
contrast, the communists, who were also part of the revolution in 1979, we didn't see who that leader was. And in
mm,
the end, the Islamists won and the communists were decapitated. Um, or they fled and they ended up going to the United States and becoming MDs and engineers, or going to California and plotting and scheming and waiting to go back one day. Uh, and so, yeah, Reza Pahlavi is in an unenviable position. He's very Zionist, right? Like, he's
mm,
basically said, if Israel wants to annex Iran, we'll help you do it. And he's definitely owned by the United States. So Iran would become a client state of the United States if he got into control. As an outsider looking in, I think that would be better than the situation that Iran is in now. That the Islamic Republic is so bad and so dysfunctional that if I were an Iranian, I would be thinking, yeah, we'll be a colony of the United States happily. Just get us out of this situation.
mm,
And so a
mm.
lot of Iranians were furious when Trump didn't follow through with the attack, because a few decisive attacks against the state would have probably brought it down last week. I mean, it was teetering.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, do you think that the leadership on the other side of the Gulf um, are thinking seriously about what comes after the Ayatollahs? Because I think that they would probably prefer to keep a weak, feckless, corrupt Ayatollah
Yeah,
theocracy running as
yeah.
opposed to having anything new come about because, like, quite frankly, they're very conservative thinking. You know, they don't like change much because change
Yes,
threatens, various power bases and so on and so forth. And I understand all of that. But I think that if something big was going to go down and it would be the end of Iran as it's currently confabulated, there would be a massive freak out on the other side of the Gulf.
for sure. And there's reason to be worried if you're on the side of the Gulf that I'm on.
Yeah,
Iranian nationalism is one of them.
yeah,
Iran definitely thinks Iranians, as a general rule, definitely look down on Arabs. Let's just put
mm,
it that way.
mm,
And I
yeah,
think that there is a very powerful tension there. That if Reza Pahlavi became the king of a nationalist state,
mm,
are Arab borders safe? Is Arab sovereignty safe? Especially if it's a pro-Israel nationalist state. Like,
mm,
I think there's fear about what happens next. I think the devil. And you're right. Like they already know what the Islamic Republic is like. They already know how to operate within those parameters. So that's not horrible for them. I think that there's a third thing, and that is if Iran's true economic power was ever unleashed, it would be a regional superpower
Oh, I
on a
agree. I agree with that.
on a
Yeah.
grand scale. Like the
Mm,
Saudis right now are competing with Iran. If Iran was truly unleashed, there'd be no competition. It would be a
mm,
one-sided uh, disaster for the Saudis. And so I think that there's definitely a part of the Arab world that's hoping that Iran doesn't get out from underneath the jackboot of
mm,
Ayatollah Khamenei, because he's keeping Iran. He's doing to Iran what nobody else could. He's repressed the Iranian economy in such a profound way. It's hard to imagine. So uh, yeah, there's definitely reluctance on this side to see it happen. I want it to happen because I think the Iranian people deserve to be free of this nightmare.
mm.
Um, but
What would it
anyway,
take? What would it take for the United States, with or without Trump, to rethink its position with regard to Iran? Because from this conversation, it appears that only US military intervention will break the back of the mullahs and would allow the people to rise up successfully. What would be the calculus for, say, Donald Trump and or JD Vance and or anyone of that motley crew in terms of how they perceive the Middle East?
yeah, that's a great question. So here's the tragedy of all of this. During the Clinton administration, a group of Iranians secretly met in Houston, Texas, of all places,
Hmm.
to talk about the possibility of rapprochement. So basically, sometime around the 20th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, because I think it was 1999 when this happened, there was this secret meeting. And the aftermath of the secret meeting, the Islamic Republic officially apologized for the hostage taking event that took place as part of the 1979 uprising. When Iranian college students captured 50 CIA operatives and held them hostage. Um, in that moment, the Clinton administration said, "Okay, we want to be able to sell Coca-Cola in Iran again." And the government, the Islamic Republic, went, "Okay, if this is a way that we can start to bridge the gap between the two, then let's start talking about bringing back U.S. products." And then came George Bush Jr. 9/11 happened. The president of Iran, by the way, was Khatami, who was a reformer
Mm,
who was trying to change laws within Iran, reform the state, and bring it back into the position of being able to trade with the West. And when 9/11 happened, Khatami issued a statement saying, "We condemn all forms of terrorism. We stand with the United States in this moment. And if the United States needs any assistance from the Islamic Republic, we are ready to give it."
mm,
And we came back to them and said, "You are in a proxy war with the Taliban in Afghanistan. You have the Northern Alliance as your allies. We want to make contact with the Northern Alliance because we're going to attack Afghanistan. Will you help us?" And Iran said, "We are absolutely ready to help you. We can't wait to help you. We hate the Taliban. We have an enemy of an enemy, but it's not just that. We want to be your friend again. So we're there." And they did. They set us up, and we went into Afghanistan using the Northern Alliance. And the initial phase was very successful because of that. Obviously, it turned into a disaster, but in the beginning, right, there was initially some successes, even if they fell apart pretty quickly. And then came the State of the Union address in 2002.
The old axis of evil.
Axis of evil, and all the hardliners in the Islamic Republic went there. When you work with the great Satan, you will be stabbed in the back. And the power for the reformers came out from underneath them. And then the next thing you know, we ended up with Ahmadinejad, who was, the Iranian Trump. He was just this buffoonish guy. And, 2009 uprising in the United States sat back and watched and did nothing. It almost feels like the United States wants the Islamic Republic to stay in charge. It almost feels like the United States loves that there's a boogeyman, that loves that the Iranian economy is crushed like it is, and loves that Iran isn't a regional power and is leaving it stuck in this state on purpose, because there have been so many opportunities to change the direction. And I still can't believe how nasty the backstabbing betrayal of Khatami was in that 2002 State of the Union address. Because you couldn't help but think that maybe Bush was just so dumb he didn't know. But at the same time, surely somebody in his administration knew. They could have told him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They still had adults in the room, right? Back in those days.
Right, yeah. And in so many ways, Khatami was like the Gorbachev for Iran. This was the opportunity to change Iran, and the United States deliberately threw it away. So fast forward to today, Trump said help is on the way, and I have an insider who told me that there was help on the way, and yet the help never came about. And what was the conversation that led to that? I don't believe that it was just Egypt and Saudi Arabia who talked the United States out of it. Like, there were probably people within the administration who also were against doing this. And I can't help but wonder if it's just part of the old playbook. Look, let's leave this thing intact. We've got a good thing going here. And of course, for Russia, they need Iran to be isolated like this, because Iran provides Russia with drones. Iran provides Russia with discounted oil that Russia then sells, because Russia doesn't need it, right? Russia already is an exporter for oil. But it's a way that Iran can get around the sanctions, in the same way Venezuela was getting around the sanctions. Right. That empty oil tanker, that Russian oil tanker, was going to go pick up the Venezuelan oil and then sell it as Russian oil.
Do you think, Roy? Do you think that Putin's actually suffered suffered from the slings and arrows of fate, in terms of Russia's strategic footprint has slowly but gradually been reduced? I mean, they were kicked out of Syria, they kicked out of Venezuela. Iran looked a bit dodgy, and for a moment there, we all thought that perhaps, if the Americans went in and the rebellion were to continue, maybe the Ayatollahs would be finished. If that were to happen, irrespective, say for instance, every conceivable government, no matter how rancid, has a lifespan, and that, whether from external or internal positioning, that government will just end. What will that do to Russia? Because, as you rightly point out, the Iranians have given across their Shahed drone technology. They're still supplying the Russian war machine. Take the Iranian pin out after they've just lost Syria, they've lost Venezuela, and then they lose Iran. Speculate for me what they will do for Russian power internationally.
So one of the things I think that drove Putin to attack Ukraine is this profound sense of paranoia that the Russians have. They believe they're under siege all the time. I don't know if this predates Napoleon, but I feel like since Napoleon, there's been this sense on the part of the Russians that the Western Europe is coming for us and we have to defend ourselves. And one of the ways in which I think they can do that is by growing and expanding outward. And so if Iran came apart and Putin lost the Islamic Republic, I think it would just fuel their paranoia even more. When the United States did something really, really dumb in I think it was 2008. Towards the end of the George Bush administration, might have been 2006. NATO members met in Bucharest, Romania, to talk about what NATO was going to do with Georgia and Ukraine. And the Europeans were desperate that NATO not be expanded to include Ukraine and Georgia, because the fear was it would just antagonize the Russians. It would fuel the Russian paranoia. And George Bush Jr. was insisting that it be expanded to include Ukraine and Georgia. So the NATO leadership, United States and Europe, came up with the dumbest, worst possible compromise ever imagined in human history. And it was to announce that at some point Ukraine and Georgia would be added to NATO, and then never do it.
Well, that's a very American thing to do, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you raise people's expectations and then you pull the rug from under them. It's
Exactly.
happened before and a number of times, right? Yeah.
So I'm going to poke Putin in the eyes and then leave Ukraine and Georgia just waiting to get attacked.
Yeah.
And they both got attacked. And like in retrospect, you're like, wow, did you not see this coming? Of course not. It was the worst imaginable. Either, let them in or announce you're not going to let them in, but don't do them. And I feel like so much of U.S. foreign policy has been that way. And I think that has successfully fueled some of the Russian paranoia. And you go, well, maybe if the U.S. would spend a little bit more time thinking through these things, we wouldn't have that. But yeah, if I was Putin, I'd be in full panic mode about losing Iran. It would be a disaster.
Okay, so let's. I know the time is. My God, I can't believe we've already been on for so long. I mean, I appreciate the time you're putting in, Roy. Believe it. But I want to go into American domestic politics at the moment because, of course, the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE officer in Minnesota triggered protests and national outrage. I mean, this isn't just an immigration issue. It's about the use of force. It's about federal authority and whether enforcement has become performative rather than strategic. Roy, are we reaching a point where aggressive enforcement is beginning to cost political capital rather than build it?
I don't know, because I think this is part of the playbook. Trump wants to sow chaos in U.S. cities. That is his goal. So I don't. If he was a normal politician, this would be a disaster, right? If he was a normal politician, he might have gotten impeached for this because, first of all, why are the ICE operatives going from city to city doing this, right? It probably violates multiple laws. It's unconstitutional. I'm wondering if the Posse Comitatus Act is being violated. There's so many things involved here that makes you wonder, what's the jurisdiction here? But because it's Trump, the Republicans fear him and they worship him, so they will do everything they can to back him and support him. So there's no consequences for anything, to the point where, I wouldn't be surprised if he's reelected in 2028, even though there are term limits and he can't run for reelection.
Oh, please say it isn't so.
No, I'm betting he's going to actually win re-election in 2028. That's how bad I think things are, and so I don't know. I don't understand the system anymore. He's done 100 things that should have gotten him removed from office. But when you compare it to Nixon, so I despise, loathe, hate Nixon. This isn't my attempt to justify anything Nixon has ever done. But what he did to get Watergate, to start the impeachment hearings, that he resigned the day the impeachment hearings began in the United States House of Representatives, to get to the point where they were actually going to do impeachment, he spied on the Democrats in a hotel. That's nothing. That's so minor. It's almost like, who cares? Now, the reality is he rigged the election in 1968 and nobody wanted to bust him for that. So this was the excuse to bust him for that. Okay, so there was actually a really catastrophic thing, but the American public went along with, oh yeah, you can't spy on the other party. That's wrong. And then you compare it to the one thing after the other that Trump has done, and you go, what? Why is this allowed when the other thing was so minor? And so I think uh, the playbooks, the old rules, are just completely out the window. And the American public has no memory span. It used to be we had a 2-year memory span. I don't even think it's a 2-month memory span. And that's part of Trump's playbook, right? Is keep people so distracted and so filled with action that they can't remember what just happened, so that we elect a president who did an attempted coup d'etat.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's insane.
you, well, it is insane, and I suppose it really comes down to power, the exercise of power, and what Trump can get away with. I suppose there is another argument doing the rounds at the moment, and that is, Trump still has institutions that restrain his worst instincts in a way that nothing would restrain a Vladimir Putin or a Kim Jong-un or a Xi Jinping. What do you say to people who come up with this and say that, well, I mean, the American Republic isn't dead. It's, just going through a couple of unfortunate series of events.
Yeah. So okay, so there used to be this argument in political science about what was more important, leadership or institutions.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that
And
one. Yeah.
yeah, and the argument was that the United States had built such amazing, robust institutions that nothing could be done to upend that. I think anybody who thinks that those institutions are still intact in the United States isn't paying close attention. Trump has shredded those institutions. They no longer function. And the idea that there's something restraining him is nonsense at this point. He literally does everything he wants to. I mean, he destroyed part of the White House on a whim because he wants to build a ballroom that's even bigger than the White House. And there was actually a law in place that prevented the president of the United States from doing something like that. He had to go through this process with the Historical Society to make sure that any renovation done in the White House complied with the historical value of the White House. Next thing you know, they're just tearing it down. There's no law. So we are in a post-law, post-constitutional era. The only thing holding Trump back is the possibility that there is an uprising, because the Supreme Court totally backs Trump. They will do everything and anything he wants. The United States Congress no longer functions, and the Republicans in the United States Congress will back him every step of the way. So those two branches, this idea that there are 3 branches of government that they can push back, well, that's dead. That's gone. And Trump snaps his finger, does an executive order, and the next thing you know, he's upended what looked like was a solid law, a solid institution, and he's just in complete defiance of it. I don't see there being any restraints. There are no institutions holding him back.
And then there are the other aspects, and I hate to raise it, and maybe they're not to be believed because everything is just a movable feast right now, but polling, right? Yeah. Trump's popularity and the American electorate more broadly seems to suggest that, yes, Trump retains a loyal base, but over time it's become narrower, older, less dominant. Younger voters, independents, and even some Republicans appear increasingly uneasy, not just with the outcomes, but with the methods. Roy, are we seeing some limits on transactional politics, not necessarily by institutions pushing back, but by the people who feel that their president doesn't represent them, that their president only represents MAGA?
So that's what people thought in 2018. The American public voted and turned both the Senate and the House over to the Democrats. In 2020, the American public voted for Biden, and the Democrats kept both houses of Congress. And then in 2022, the Senate flipped back. Sorry, no, the House flipped back to the Republicans. And then in 2024, Trump won, and then he won both houses. And you're like, wait, how did we get back to this place? It's almost like there's a population of Americans who just have catastrophic amnesia and can't remember what just happened. And so it is possible that this year is an election year that one or both houses of Congress will flip back to the Democrats. And it is possible that Trump won't get reelected in 2028. I mean,
I'd like to be optimistic.
But like think through the exercise. So he announces he's running. So then At that point, he ends up on the ballots in the primaries. Will the Republican Party, not the states, determine who's on the ballots? So in other words, it's not like it's the government that does this. It's a private political party that's not part of the government that does this.
Right.
So
Right.
for the primaries, there's nothing to stop him from being on the ballot. So then he wins the Republican primary. Well, it'll go to the Supreme Court then. There'll be an argument that he can't run again because there's a constitutional amendment that bans him from running again. It'll go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will say that there's no standing because according to US law, you can't sue unless you've been harmed. Well, him running for office doesn't harm anybody. It's him winning office. Well, once he wins, then what's the Supreme Court going to say? Well, he's already in power. You can't do anything. He's the president. The president's immune from any legal action. And that's it.
But this raises, I mean, from an Australian perspective, listening to you and having been brought up with the sanctity of the US Constitution constantly in my ear, you know, because we're very, I suppose we've got a very pro-American culture here. We've got, you know, we've absorbed American culture and politics and all this over the years. And the one thing that I know is that for many years, everyone said, we will never have a dictatorship in this country because the US Constitution, our founding fathers made sure the Constitution had all these caveats and whatever. But we're starting to see this all unravel. I mean, the US Constitution was what, drafted in 1776, or at least put into place in 1776, under very different circumstances from today. And it hasn't changed with the times. I suppose for some Americans, that may have been a superpower of the American Constitution. It didn't change, so therefore it was good. But I don't know. I'm yet to be convinced. I think people probably were trying to say that the Constitution was something that it actually wasn't. I don't know.
So the first Constitution for the United States went into effect in 1781. It was written by Ben Franklin. It's called the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
It was a catastrophe. It was an awful, awful, awful government, awful document. It led to uprising. Eventually, we did the Constitutional Convention and drafted a new constitution that was written by James Madison. And that went into effect in 1789. It has had 27 amendments since then. So it has definitely not kept up with the times. For the record, the first 10 amendments and the 27th Amendment were written by the guy who wrote the Constitution, James Madison. So 11 of the 27 amendments were written by the same guy who wrote the Constitution. So it means it was you don't even have new ideas coming in at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so I agree that at some level, the US Constitution has stalled out as an 18th century document. Having said that, I'm now pretty cynical. I think that documents don't have the kind of power. I think the lesson that we are learning is that documents and the institutions they create don't have the kind of power necessary if the people don't understand them and the people don't back them. That the most important thing is that there be public buy-in at the local level. Like the individuals have to buy. So in other words, if you ask me, is Australia going to face the possibility of a dictator down the road? That's always on the table. But I think it's a lot less likely because the Australian public is well educated and they've bought in. And I think the same is true for Sweden and Finland and New Zealand and Botswana. You know what I mean? Like there's a group of states that I think are safe for the most part. I mean, by safe, I mean like, 99%, because nothing's ever 100%. Canada is another place I throw into the mix. In case the United States, since at least 1981, we've been cutting education funding. And it turns out after 45 years of just eviscerating education funding, the US public is stupid. They don't know anything and they don't understand the basic premise. There is at least 30% of the US public that thinks that everything Trump does is amazing. And they've totally drunk the Kool-Aid. There's no doubt in their minds that he is going to create the Christian Republic of America, and he's going to destroy the evil liberals who eat children. And he is Jesus Christ come back or inspired by Jesus in any case. Like they have lost their mind. A bunch of them are flat earthers, and they think that the government had lizard people in charge. And we're in trouble. We're in trouble in the United States. And it's 45 years of education cuts. This is on purpose. politicians realize stupid people will vote in stupid ways that hurt them, and they intentionally engineered this situation. The tragedy is we've seen the consequences. It turns out it was a really bad idea.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah.
And also not helped by the fact that the current crop of oligarchs are continuing to double down on technology that makes people even more stupid and susceptible to believe almost anything. So it's like a self-licking ice cream, if you will, of horror in terms of pulling education away from young people and the next generation because it's been,
every
basically
time
sliced off us.
every time I've done an AI search, usually
Yep.
just because I did a search on Google, and then there's this, Gemini at the top, and then you can just see what the result is. Because I rarely do an intentional AI search.
Mm.
Actually speaking, I would give it like beyond an F minus. Like I think it's right about facts 10% of the time. And if you read the text carefully, it will frequently contradict itself.
Mhm.
AI is not good for figuring out what is reality. And I'm scared because there's all these people now who are doing, and they just read the top AI
Yep.
search and they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And it's some
Mm.
really stupid result that's completely ahistorical and not factual. And I'm scared that this is actually just going to dumb people down even more.
Mm.
And I also think we've overinvested in AI globally. Like there's this AI arms race, and I'm just
Yep.
not seeing the utility. Like I get that it's going to make it so traffic flows better if AI is controlling the traffic lights. I'm on board. I can't wait for that to be implemented everywhere.
Mm.
Um, energy production, you could probably have AI regulate that too, and it'd be more efficient because it can. But if it's going to be the system that generates decision making on the really important stuff, I think we're in trouble. I've
Bad
seen that
idea.
movie. It's called Terminator.
All right, Roy, finally, influence. There's growing discussion about the role of non-traditional platforms in shaping political opinion. Figures like Joe
Yeah.
Rogan and his Joe Rogan podcast reach audiences that political parties no longer can. This influence isn't ideological, it's cultural, it's conversational, and deeply skeptical of authority. Roy, is this where enforcement heavy politics begin to lose traction? Not because voters are more progressive, but because they're more distrustful of power exercised without legitimacy.
So I'm a person who is nervous about power to begin with. Like
Hmm.
in my heart, I have anarchistic tendencies. My mind, I don't. I'm a monarchist, but in my
Mhm.
heart, my dream is, a society where everybody gets together and through conversation and dialogue create policy. Instead of you elect some idiot to be in charge of creating the policy for you, you be the idiot creating the policy for you. That would be my dream. So at some level, I get that. I think what happens with some platforms, most platforms actually, is that they offer a simple answer.
Hmm.
And people want that simplicity, especially nowadays where the world seems so volatile, to have somebody just say, no, I think the answer is X. And, for me, the answer is never X. It's going to be X, Y, Z, A, B. There's going to be an alpha and a beta too,
Hmm.
because the world is just complicated and it's extremely messy. It's shades of gray. And I think one of the appeals of shows like that is, you can have a person who doesn't necessarily know much about a topic speculate and
Hmm.
then come up with a really simplistic answer. And then the listener can go, oh, okay, I get that. And I think that was the appeal of Rush Limbaugh back in the
Hmm.
day, right? He would distill these complicated policy issues into why you should hate people who aren't white and Christian. And then the listener could just go, boom, I get it. Immigrants are the problem. I mean, you're
Hmm.
right. They got this totally idiotic, simplistic answer. But I think we've always been like that as a species. I think the danger now only is that idiotic, simplistic answer has bigger outreach, right? It has bigger appeal. Like I'll give you one of my weird things. Every time I run into a person who's really upset about transgender issues, the thought that pops into my head is, why do you care? Why are you so obsessed with what that person is? I mean, first of all, come at it from a sympathy point of view. that person is gender unstuck in a universe where everything is genderized. Like we genderize ships, right? And then there are languages that genderize everything. In German, there's 3 genders because there's Neuter too. There's everything has a gender, and that gender can, by the way, change depending on whether it's accusative, nominative, genitive, or dative. And you're like, you want to tear your hair out. Like, why did you over-engineer the word the? Anyway, so instead of having sympathy for this person who's unstuck gender, their gender has become unstuck in this complicated world, people are mad. And I don't get it because it has nothing to do with them. It's not like their gender alignment is being questioned. It's that other person. And so one of the things that I think we've done as a species is we become so obsessed with what the other person is doing instead of focusing on what we're doing. And I think that distraction helps us from dealing with our own issues. Like, the reason I'm in a screwed up situation is that guy's screwed up, instead of, no, I've screwed myself up. There's one of the things that I keep hearing Iranians say is that the reason why Iran is in such a bad position is because the Arabs conquered Iran 1,400 years ago. And it's like, dude, that was 1,400 years ago. You haven't done anything since to fix this, right? Like you're finding a way to have an excuse for your screwed up situation instead of you confronting your screwed up situation. You're finding a scapegoat, whether it's immigrants or transgender kids or an event that took place 1,400 years ago. It's a way of comforting yourself and avoiding the complexity of the world that we're in. So that's why I think the appeal comes from.
All right. Well, Roy, it's a wrap. I thank you very much for the time that you put in, and I look forward to catching up with you in Dubai in a couple of weeks. For our audience, awesome. Roy and I are going to be speaking at the World Government Summit, so I'm going to take this opportunity to say good day to Roy in person, which will be fantastic. So anyway, until 2 weeks from now, Roy, I will see you later. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for the first episode of The Focus in 2026. We've got a big year ahead. More conversations, sharper analysis, and a continued commitment to ask questions others don't. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. From Adelaide, South Australia, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to The Focus.